Well, folks, I've got these SMC True-Spec 1300 milliamp hour 4S batteries rated for 37 amps. I told you about them a little while back. I've had a chance to fly them, and I am ready to render a verdict in true YouTube fashion. I'm not going to give you my verdict until the end, but let's get into the tests I did and the results. The first thing I did was I put these batteries up and I did some NASCAR laps with them. I know, NASCAR turns left and I'm turning right, but you get the idea. It's a wide, high-speed oval. The throttle is between about 1600 and 1750 for the entire time that we're going around, and we're pulling between about 35 and 55 or maybe even as much as 60 amps. So this is a really tough test on the battery. The battery doesn't get any chance to recover. It's really just given its all for the whole time. I show you this video here just to give you a sense of what the test was like. And then let's go ahead and take a look at the spreadsheet with the actual numbers. The first test that I did was with TJ5045 props. That's the Dow tri-blades. I used those props because I thought they would draw more current and test the batteries, work them a little harder. And I did some laps with the Nanotech 1800 milliamp hour 65C. Now I expect this battery to beat the other two batteries handily because it's a larger battery with a high C rating. And you can see here that it clearly did. It held its voltage better, right, compared to the SMC True-Spec, and the other battery that I used in my test was Nanotech 1300 milliamp hour 45C battery. This one is not factory fresh. It's not brand new. It's been flown for about 6 months. It's got a lot of cycles on it. It's still the battery I fly, so it still performs okay, but it's not a fair comparison. But I figured I'd put it in the test because, just give the other battery somebody to punch, right? Anyway, the 1800 did better, as you would expect. It delivered more volts and more watts. The lap times were not quite as fast. That's partially due to the heavier battery, but also it's partially due to the fact that about halfway through this run, I found a slightly better line, and then I used that line in subsequent tests. So I have to acknowledge that, and we'll sort of have to ignore the lap times for this run a little bit because it's not fair. That's the human factor in the testing. There's nothing you can do about it, really, except to have robots fly the copter, right? Someday, maybe. The True-Spec versus the Nanotech, I felt like the True-Spec was sagging really early in the tests and bottoming out. And so, for example, if you look at this trial, we can see that by the fourth lap, the True-Spec hit 13 volts, whereas the old 45C Nanotech battery never hit that. It never went that low. It dropped to like 13.7. Now, I paused and let the battery recover, and it came back up and it put in a few more laps. So, but I consistently saw the True-Spec seem to sag more and then recover, whereas the Nanotech seemed to sort of hold its voltage more and swing less. So I wasn't sure how to interpret that. I mean, if you stop the race the minute your battery hits 13 volts, and then the True-Spec is going to lose. It's going to put in 4 laps and be done, and the Nanotech will still be going. But if you're willing to let the battery recover, then I think the True-Spec did better. And so since I wasn't able to interpret it, I went and I got some data. This is the black box data for the battery, and I charted it, and I got a garbled mess that I couldn't make any sense out of because there's so many data points that it's all just compressed and you can't really read it. So I did a 1.5 second moving average, and I got this. And I think this really tells the tale. This shows that the True-Spec battery, despite the fact that it seems to sag a little more and bottom out a little more and then recover, despite that fact, overall, it's doing much better, right? So for this particular run, we can see that the True-Spec battery, it's regularly operating at a higher average level than the Nanotech. Even though sometimes it sags a little lower, if you compare the roughly corresponding sags like this one to this one, you can see they're sagging to about the same level, but then the True-Spec is recovering to a much higher level, and the Nanotech is sagging much lower. By the way, ignore this part here at the end. That's just where I've backed off the throttle and I'm landing, so that doesn't mean anything. The next thing I did was a punch-out test where I did a pretty hard punch-out and I watched how low the battery sagged. Let's take a look at that. Here the SMC True-Spec battery hits about 87 amps at 14.1 volts very early in the punch-out, If we then continue to watch the rest of the punch out, it holds at around 78 amps and 14.2 volts. On the second punch out, it put out about 84 amps and sagged to about 13.4 volts. And here in the third punch out, it hits 88 amps and 13.7 volts very early in the punch out. We'll keep watching till the end of the punch out and see what it does. So you can see here that as soon as I've backed off the throttle, it's back up to 15.5 volts, 15.7 volts. It's essentially fully charged. And now I'll do some just regular acro flight. And as you watch it, you can see it's not really suffering too much. You know, it's basically acting like a fully charged battery. So I'm not suggesting that those punch outs were good for it. It's never good to dump the battery down to 13 volts. But the battery is performing pretty well, even though we punished it very much there at the beginning. And here we've got the Nanotech 45C. This is the old dogged out, used up battery. Let's see how it does. So here we're putting out about 87 amps at about 13.9 volts. It's pretty comparable to the SMC, roughly comparable. I think it was at around 14.0, 14.2. But in the second test, the Nanotech is much worse, pulling 81 amps and already sagging to 13.4 volts. And in the third test, again peaking around 80 amps, dropping to 13.5 volts. But again, notice that as soon as we back off the throttle, we go up to about 15.6, 15.7 volts. And then as we do some acro flying, normal flying, battery voltage is basically normal. So I think in this particular test, we could say that the Nanotech did slightly worse, but not definitively worse. So what can we conclude from this? Well, the True-Spec in this test beat a 6-month-old 45C Nanotech. Okay, well, that's not concluding very much. But it definitely did not beat or even compare to an 1800 milliamp hour 65C Nanotech. And that's interesting because if we looked at the internal resistance number that was on the product page, it showed an internal resistance of about 5 or 6 milliohms. And if we put that through the calculator that I showed you in the previous video about the SMC battery rating, that says that it should give about 37 amps. And if we take the internal resistance of these 1800s, it shows about the same number. So I kind of hoped that these 1300 milliamp hour batteries would do about as well as these 1800s, but they didn't. And in fact, if we look at the internal resistance of these batteries on my battery meter, I show an internal resistance for these batteries of about 6 to 9 milliohms per cell. Really, I don't think any of them, I'm not 100% sure that none of them hit 5 milliohms. Maybe a few of them hit 5 milliohms on one of the cells, but most of them didn't. Now, I don't have the fancy equipment that they have at SMC to test internal resistance. I just have my battery meter. And I didn't test the batteries under like controlled laboratory conditions. So I'm not prepared to say that I didn't get what I was promised, because you could potentially send these exact same batteries back to SMC. They could put it on their equipment under their lab conditions and it could test out to 5 milliohms. But I will say that if you run the numbers through, if you run the numbers that SMC promises through that formula, that calculator, this battery should perform as well as an 1800, and it doesn't. But honestly, isn't that to be expected, right? So what's the final takeaway? I feel like this battery is honestly rated, and I feel like it's worth $23. I feel like it stacks up well against other $23 batteries on the market. For example, the Nanotech 1300 milliamp hour 45C that I'm flying runs about $23, $24. I don't remember the exact price. And I feel like brand new, these two batteries would compete well against each other. They perform very similarly. Of course, mine is old and used up, and so it performed worse. I had some hopes that this battery would like knock my socks off and surprise me. Like the 37 amp rating would be really conservative and the battery would actually hold its own against some much higher rated batteries. And I don't think that happened. I feel like the 37 amp rating is, obviously you can pull more All right, I was doing tests where I was pulling a continuous 35 to 60 amps. And let me tell you, those batteries came down. They were more than warm. I didn't hit them with a thermometer, but they were more than warm. They weren't too hot to touch, but they were definitely hot. They were not happy. Okay, so that 37 amp rating is, it may be a little conservative, but it's not super conservative. And I will say that if there's a battery out there that has an honest 60C rating, then it'll probably beat this battery. I feel like this battery, if you were to sell it with a C rating, you could probably sell it with a 45C rating with a little bit of a straight face. But it is not, I don't think, the highest performance 1300 to 1500 milliamp hour pack on the market. And it is not like a sleeper pack where for $23 you're going to get this amazing pack that's going to knock out $35 packs. Well, it'll knock out some $35 packs because they're overpriced and overrated, right? But if you're getting good quality $35 packs that have a semi-honest 60C rating, then they're probably going to beat this one. And that leads me to one other point that I think is important to make. The 1800 milliamp hour pack spanked this thing up one side and down the other. And so if you are racing and if you are putting out really high amp draw and you're running like big motors and drawing lots of current, I think you got to seriously think about going up to the bigger battery. An 1800 milliamp hour Nanotech 65C is going to do better than probably a $35 13 or 1500 milliamp hour pack, or maybe even a more expensive one, simply by nature of the fact that it's a bigger pack and it's easier to squeeze more current out of it. So as I think about racing and think about if I was going to do a 2-lap race, right, where I was just going to go all out for 2 laps, maybe I wouldn't bother. But especially if it was a longer race, I think you really got to think about going to the 1800s, not just because they have more capacity, but because they will hold higher voltage and put out more watts over the longer life. Whereas a 1300, if you have a 60C 1300, it may give its guts for a minute and then die and then just gag and die, okay? Whereas the 1800 milliamp hour will still have something left to give 2 or 3 or 4 laps in. Oh, and of course, if the race you're in allows you to run high volts, that's what you should be running because, a high volt 1300 will probably, that'd be an interesting test. Would a high volt 1300 beat the 1800 65C? I feel like they might be comparable. Yeah, the only problem with saying you should run high volts is that they're constantly out of stock everywhere. What are you going to do? That's why I bought these SMCs. I would love to buy high volts. They're kind of out of stock everywhere. So my conclusion on these SMCs is that I feel like for $23, they're a battery worth buying. And I'm very pleased that the manufacturer is giving you honest specs instead of hand-wavy numbers. And for that alone, compared to some other manufacturers who may have equal performing batteries, I'm inclined to give them some business. But I don't feel like this is the ultimate highest performing 13 to 1500 milliamp hour 4S pack on the market, unless I test some other prominent names and find that they all do no better, in which case maybe this is just it. That's just it. Hope that was all helpful, and as always, happy flying.